Hello everyone, Burb here. Today I want to explore a mechanic that was added to the game in the 7.1 patch known as power conservation. This is also known as the fully charged mechanic. And I want to do a couple things in this video. I want to of course explain what it is, but more than that I want to go and delve into the mathematical equation that drives this new mechanic. After that I want to give a few useful comparisons. I want to explore the new efficiency of power now that fully charged is in the game versus what power had prior to this mechanic. After that, I want to give a comparison between the added acceleration that power conservation gives you compared to that of a 0.2 white perfect proc acceleration skill. I find that this is the most important and most useful comparison in answering the ultimate question of should you really be prioritizing pumping power above 1200 power. That was a lot of P's. So let's begin. So how do we believe power conservation actually works? Well, when you are in pace down mode or not in overtake mode, if you're a front runner, you charge up an invisible timer. You get this timer high enough, and then at the start of the late race, hopefully because you have enough stamina, it's technically at the start of your character spurt, you release a burst of bonus acceleration. So it essentially works like an acceleration perfect proc skill, okay? Realistically, there's some level of pace down mode for all roles except front runner, and if you're a front runner, you're not in overtake mode 100% of the time. And from my testing, even while breaking PDM near instantly with a straight skill on certain long tracks, let's say, I still find that I get the fully charged effect, which means that I think this is just a way for side games to add bonus value to power, and I think that was the actual intent, which I will get into right now. We have to do a bit of groundwork. First of all, if you see power stat, what it is talking about in the equation that power stat appears in is that it is your visual power stat that you see at the end of your career. After 1200, however, it does only do 50% contribution, meaning that if you see, let's say, 1300 power, that extra 100 power above 1200 is only at half effectiveness. So unless stated otherwise, the power stat for 1300 power is really only 1250 power instead. So power after 1200 naturally has less effect on acceleration prior to the addition of power conservation. We have not actually gone through the acceleration equation on this channel before, but note it is rather large. It is basically your base acceleration times square root of 500 times the power stat that I just talked about, multiplied by your strategy phase coefficient, ground time proficiency modifier, distance proficiency modifier, and then added on to the skills and start dash modifier, which we will talk about at a later date. Realistically, the last two are the skill portion, and they are additive to your actual acceleration based on power, so they are not relevant for this discussion. For the rest of them, your distance proficiency modifier, as long as you have more than D of your distance, so let's say, sprint in this case, you're going to not take any penalty to your acceleration. So this will be a 1.0 in pretty much every situation that we care about. For the ground type proficiency modifier, if you're at A, it's also a 1.4. If you have a turf or dirt S, whatever is relevant, you will have a bonus 5% that is multiplicative with the rest of the equation. But for now, we are also going to consider that 1. For the strategy phase coefficient, late surgers do have a 1.0 strategy phase coefficient, and the other ones are slightly lagging behind. But for the purposes of this, the worst case scenario of end closer is only still 2.3% total, and I don't think that that will be much relevance in the order of magnitude that we're actually talking about here. So I will also assume that to be 1 for the purposes of comparison. So we are going to remove all that, and now this equation looks a lot nicer and easier for us to handle. Note that your base accel is 0.006 meters per second square, except when you're running uphill. If you are acceleration during a uphill, like the Tokyo track, it is technically reduced by 33% to 0.004. We are going to consider only the situations where you're not accelerating in the uphill, because this should be basically kind of added to both sides anyway. So for simplicity reasons, we're going to assume not an uphill, which is like 90% of tracks in the acceleration zone. And then after that, we are just going to plug in our power stat. For an example, at 800 power, we would take 0.006 times the square root of 500 times 800. That 500 times 800 becomes 400,000. We take the square root of that for 632.5. We multiply that by our base acceleration of not 0.0006, whatever. Sorry, I messed that up. And we get 0.379 meters per second squared of acceleration. To put that in perspective, a white scalar is 0.2 meters per second squared of acceleration. So you get a lot of your acceleration from power itself. The thing is, as power increases, it is technically a square root relationship, or I guess a exponential relationship, but not inverted, but I don't know what the actual term is called. But if you plug this in on a graph, basically the more power you actually have, the less actual acceleration transfer that you are added to it. This is not including the 1200 at the moment, but you can see the difference between 800, like we said, was giving us 0.379 Accel right there, 0.379 Accel. If we go and add to 900, we are only getting 0.4, so it is a very minor increase compared to that of let's say 400 acceleration is giving us all the way down to 0.27. So the more power that you have, the less transfer to acceleration that actually occurs. And remember that after 1200 power, every point after that is only half as effective as 0.1200. And so we have our final power transfer equation, I guess, to acceleration. They're at the bottom of the screen if you wish, and you want to plug it into, I think, Delmos graphing calculator, but essentially it kind of bottoms off after 1200, and you don't get much effect at all, really, when adding additional power to 1201. To put in perspective, that 1201 power value, the extra point above 1200, only gets applied as a half point of power in the equation, and you do the math, and you find that that additional acceleration is really only 0.00014 acceleration. To put it in perspective, to get the value of an updrafters, which would be 0.06 acceleration because it's 3 seconds, so this is updrafters, the mile skill, you'd have to go all the way to 1,840 power to cross over the threshold that you get the same value of a perfect proc updrafters proc. So that's 640 power for a 0.2 acceleration for 3-second equivalent, which is kind of insane because that is a ton of investment into power when there's so many things in this game that you got to do. I mean, realistically, you race 2 races and you have enough skill points for an acceleration skill perfect rocking like that. So I think this was the intent of this mechanic, is that Cygames saw this and said, hey, power is completely useless, really, after a little bit above 1200, honestly, now that we've halved it. So that's where power conservation comes in. It is meant to give additional value to power after 1200. And the power conservation equation, it says for power stat above 1200, if your power stat is above 1200, your acceleration also gets added an additional square root of your power stat minus 1200, so only the additional 1200 above 1200 power stat multiplied by 130 with the entire square rooted quantity basically multiplied by 0.001, which is also known as dividing by 1,000, and then multiplied by the strategy distance coefficient and what's something called the activity coefficient. For now, we're not going to go and worry about the last 2 bits. We'll bring them back in a little bit later. So we're only going to talk about the stuff that's affected by the power stat at the current moment. Note that this subtracts 1200 from your power. So when I keep saying this is not a magical threshold, note that yes, the first one, because this is still a square root relationship, has added value over the next one. It's not just like a wall. Your UMA is not just completely glue if it doesn't hit 1,201. And also remember that this is affected by mood and by green skills as well. Also, power conservation, like I said, the exception was if they don't take in, it's halved unless stated otherwise. This is one of the mechanics that states otherwise. Power stat is your visual power stat. It is not your power stat with added 1/2. So 1300 power is 1300 power stat in this equation. Let's take the example of 1201 power. 1201 power, that additional 1 bonus point, we take the acceleration of this equation, which is the square root of 1201 minus 1200, also known as 1. Multiply that by 130 for the square root of 130. We then divide by 1,000 because that's the same thing as multiplying by 0.001, like I said, and we find that we have a value of 11.4 over 1,000 or 0.011 acceleration. To compare this with the original power, before 1 power was only equal to 0.00014 Accel. After the first point above 1200 gives you 0.011 Accel, added also to the original increase that power gives you. So essentially, this first additional point of power is worth 79.6 times more effective than what power was previously, which sounds like a lot until you realize that you still have, the absolute value of power. Remember that this is talking about 0.01 acceleration, also known as basically 1/20th of a actual white scale, if that makes sense. There's a couple more things to take into account. Let's take the example of 1250. You plug it in, you get 50 times 130 for a square root of 6,500. You do that math and you find it adds an additional 0.081 Accel. You do it for 1400, and at 1400 power, it's 200, which becomes 26,000, which then becomes 0.161 Accel. And that's really where we're getting to the point. 200 power is roughly equivalent to that of a 0.2 scale. And we find on the graph. This is kind of what I was trying to lead to. I completely overlapped my actual legend, but the red itself is the power increase if you're just doing raw power. The blue is the increase due to power conservation, and the green is both of them actually combined. And this does seem like an incredible amount. You can see there is basically a new exponential relationship happening right here. So even this first 10 looks like it is a lot, but do note here that this is like 0.47 right here, and this is like 0.5. So even at an additional 20, it's good value, but it's not like backbreaking. That's kind of the point of this graph. The other two coefficients kind of bring them down into line. Strategy distance and coefficient and activity coefficient are two rather simple things to explain. First of all, if you are a front runner, it's just 1.0 for your strategy distance coefficient. You have full effectiveness of this mechanic. For pretty much everyone else, it's kind of determined based on the actual distance. That's what it is to be believed. For most of us, it is basically 0.7. Late starters have a little bit more on sprints. Pace chasers have a little bit more on miles, mediums, and longs. And for the rest of us, it gets a little bit higher the closer we are to long. But for the sprint track, we are considering it to be 0.7 because that is for pace chasers. That's what most of us are going to be. And honestly, like I said, we're at the order of magnitude. This won't really matter for this equation. And the other one, which is activity coefficient, is just two minor penalties for certain things that could happen. I believe that lead competition kind of just means leading the race at the time of proc. I could be wrong on this. Someone in the comments can correct me for it. It could also mean possibly the same thing that works in team trials, where you're leading the race when compared to the rest of the other UMAs that are in your current strategy. That's the other interpretation that I can see makes sense. Either way, it's only a 2% penalty. The big one is just if you're rushed, you lose 20% of its value. I'm not going to take that into account. I'm going to assume you're not rushing on this. And also the other thing that you have to take into account, that this is believed to be a 3-second duration. It doesn't matter, and it doesn't seem to matter really how much is actually charged. Supposedly it does, but even on the race mechanic stock, it says it's believed to just be a 3-second duration, essentially acceleration buff. To put this in perspective, if you proc a 0.6 Accel on this Nakayama 1200 meter track, you're going to take 7.1 seconds to hit your max speed. And this is roughly close to what it is on most tracks, give or take a little bit. But using this benchmark, we can also go and add a modifier because it's only partial of the actual acceleration zone. Because we're comparing it to power, which affects the whole acceleration zone, we can see that essentially 42% of the acceleration zone is affected by this particular mechanic. So it would stop roughly around here, let's say. And so we add all of these modifiers up. We take, let's say, a 30% penalty from being any role besides front runner, and we take a 60 or 58% penalty from just not having max duration, and we find it's a little bit more in line. This one actually took into account the having of power afterwards. But we find that, yes, it's a good bonus, but it is a little bit more in line. We can see here that, roughly at the 1300 power line, the difference is going to be between 0.48 and 0.51. Future burp here, for those who care, the Desmos graphing calculator. These are the math equations for that graph I showed before. I just thought I'd include them for those who actually want to recreate this on their own. But back to me. Take care. To put it in perspective, this is, I think, the most important comparison that I can do. I'm going to grab a drink real quick. One sec. So if you've been sort of losing it all in the math right now, now's the time to come back. A 0.05 acceleration over the course of the entire Accel zones, roughly that of which a 0.2 white skill of 2.4 seconds would give you. That's just kind of, I did that in Umamusume, and then you can see that kind of hits the same point at the top. So that's just, I guess it's trust me, bro, but realistically, 0.05 Accel roughly translates into a white 0.2 skills in value. In order to get that, you would need to get a bonus 128 power. So 1328 power is your threshold to get basically a perfect proc 0.2, which is still a lot. That is still a lot because remember, it's twice as difficult to get that level of power above 1200 at the moment. But when you compare it to what it was before for the same difference of 0.05 acceleration, before you had to go all the way to 1,771 power, which you are not going to do ever. Now it is 1,327 power, which seems at least reachable. And while you may not reach this level, and you don't necessarily need to reach this level, even at shorter amounts, even if you grab, let's say, an additional 40 power, you're basically getting the same effect of grabbing what 400 power was. And like I said, I think this is what Cygame saw. Cygame saw that power was basically, you would never be able to justify the additional acceleration that power gave you past 1200 meters. And that is why they added this additional mechanic to make it at least within the realm of reason. It's going to matter a lot more when we get to future scenarios past Grand Live, because power we can get more closer into the 1500 to 1600 range. And as you can see, it diverges a little bit more than what we have now. But realistically, what we have now is just a little boost of about 0.05 acceleration. So the final verdict on what power conservation actually is, in my personal opinion, it's a nice bonus. At the end of the day, the most value you can really get to it is roughly a 0.2, 2.4 acceleration without sacrificing too much. I don't think you're going to the 1400 to 1500 power and trying to add every single power spark in the game to get there. I think you should just naturally play the game. The reason why in the Guts build I was saying you can't really sacrifice power is, as you can see, this first little bit is still rather nice to have. Realistically, if you get less than that, even with the mood changes, your Uma's still fine, but do remember that after it, you do get some additional bonus value, and it is an exponential relationship, which means that the first bit is worth more than subsequent areas at the moment. This could still make the difference in this next champions meeting. Like I said, you want to hit 0.6 Accel, and if you're unable to get stuff like leap forward on a backliner, let's say, having that additional power is going to help you go and bridge that gap, because whatever acceleration that you're taking is most likely not going to absolutely perfect proc at that moment. It is a very welcome addition for me, because I do enjoy having stats actually mean things, and this is one way that they did to do it. So I've been a bit all over the place in this one. This was a heavy math video, and it took a lot of work, to be honest, so my voice is a little bit dead at this point, but I hope you enjoyed my sort of deep dive into this new mechanic. If you want any other mechanics actually explained, I do kind of want to figure out what you guys actually need for explaining, but it's been nice to do and go back to the roots and do a little bit of napkin math. So I hope you enjoyed it. Take care, everyone. Burb out.